In this session, we have a variety of different academics from very different disciplinary backgrounds to just reflect on changes over the past 30 years, but through the particular perspective and lens of their own disciplines as well. I just want to introduce this briefly by talking a little bit about the book series that we've put together here, which is the 30 Years of Democracy in South Africa book series. And this came out of discussions that we've been having. Abebe and I are both former directors of UNISA Press, and we've also worked very closely with Taylor and Francis and Routledge for at least over the past 20 years or so. And the idea of this collection was to relaunch important work from the past, original monographs and edited collections, to make an intervention in debates around and discussions around 30 years of democracy in South Africa. And we did this with some, what we think are important publishers to include as well. One of them is UNISA Press. Another one is Skotaville. Skotaville, my own research is on publishing history, a lot of the time on activist history and anti-apartheid publishing. And I can tell you that Skotaville is entirely unique in the history of publishing in South Africa, one of the most important, if not the most important, black-owned publisher from the 1980s onwards. So it was important to us to bring together different voices, different partners as well. And just to give you an idea of how different some of the titles are and why we're looking at this panel with such different disciplinary lenses as well, is we have works like Imagining, Writing, Rereading the Black Body, edited by Sandra Jackson, Fasil Demessier, and Michelle Goodwin. We have Peter Lim's book, The ANC's Early Years, Robert Edgar's book on the making of an African communist, Edwin Thabo Mafutsanyana. We have Andile Africa's Touched by Biko, Donald Pinnock's Writing Left, and then certain volumes from The Road to Democracy in South Africa, which was produced with UNISA Press and the South African Democracy Education Trust. And I see we have Sifiso Ndlovu here with us as well from SADET, so welcome to him. The Skotaville titles, and we have Matobi Mutloatse in the audience as well, a very important publisher from our past. These are works such as One Race, The Legacy of Robert Sobukwe, Cultural Resistance on Robben Island, Speaking Truth to Power by Sipho Sepe, and a book on Seme, the founder of the ANC. So you can see it's a really wide variety of different works. We're also bringing out a collection of articles that were first published in Third World Quarterly, which has been a really important journal for reflecting on the changes across the global south. So for this panel, I'm going to not take too long myself here. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to speak for about 7 minutes to first introduce themselves, to say who they are. We have 4 speakers who are here in person and then 2 who will present online. And we've also asked Nomboniso to join us here, not to repeat her keynote, because that was brilliant as it was, but so she can also engage in the discussions and the conversations that come up. And we'd like to leave time so that we do have engagement from the audience and discussions amongst all of us as well. Though we will be pushing back that with time that we'll start lunch at 1 o'clock instead of 12:30. So that will save us some time as well. So I'd like to call on our first speaker, Raymond Suttner. Raymond, would you prefer to come and stand? So for each of you, if you'd prefer to stand at the microphone, you're welcome. Or there is a roving mic if you'd like to sit. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm described in the leaflet for this series as an independent scholar. I'm not an independent scholar. I'm a partisan scholar. I'm committed to universal freedom and to ending the continued oppression that Nomboniso referred to in her talk. When you talk about 30 years of democracy, it's a bit like people used to take the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and explain, tick boxes as to what we've got and what we don't have. I'm not going to do this. I think we have a crisis in South Africa, and the crisis for me has a few components. The first one that I want to refer to is there's no common vision shared by the people of South Africa. When we were struggling for freedom in this country, and I'm still a freedom fighter, when we were struggling for freedom, we had an idea of the society we wanted to build, and that was shared by people in all the sections of South Africa. Not everyone, but Nomboniso referred to the familial aspect of the ANC at one stage. People used to pray for the freedom fighters. People used to have on their mantelpieces the Bible, something from the ANC, and sometimes Lenin, all mixed together, so that cultural factors in building this common vision were ones that are in academic life sometimes artificially separated, because in the consciousness of the people who took part, and in the Sadet series you will see people who fought in MK were very often were often Christians or Marxists, but they also very often propitiated the ancestors before going on a mission. One of the most famous of these, Flag Boshiero, was also a Sangoma. So the first thing that I want to say is there is no common vision shared by all the people of South Africa, no concept of the nation, what it is that should unify us. In the national liberation struggle, the nation was a key question amongst many areas of division, was debated over and over again. And in a time when we have very little debate, that is one of the areas that is absent. This notion of a common good is something with long history, going back to Aristotle, used by Rousseau and Machiavelli and others. It's been debated. We need to build a notion of the common good. What do we share? What is it that we want? That is needed by everyone, not just the elite. One of the reasons why we don't have this is that while the 1980s was suffused by notions of popular power, the politics of today is the politics of an elite. And as Nomboniso indicated, the oppressions of apartheid continue into the present day with the spatial apartheid that we have. That popular power experience of the 1980s is not found today, except for pockets, because the popular is not organized. It's in some ways from 1994, the place was taken by NGOs. We need to redevelop that presence of the popular before we can have a common good. And when we were in the UDF and its affiliates, there was no notion of the UDF just being the leadership. The UDF always said, we are the affiliates. And the affiliates were people who lived in the communities and in the sectors from which they came. That needs to be rebuilt. While speaking about the popular, I'm not suggesting that what is called liberal democracy or representative, or I'd say unrepresentative democracy, I'm not suggesting it must be displaced. It must be in dialogue with the popular. It can't be a situation where people have their democracy once every 5 years only. So we need a situation where people are organized not just to vote for a party every 5 years, but they're not just mobilized for a particular demonstration, but organized in structures. And those structures should be debating. The crisis that I'm saying we have here of liberal democracy, of representative democracy, is common to the whole Western world. In the United States, in the United Kingdom, in France, everywhere, there's an alienation of political parties from the people in the countries. But it's not just an electoral question that you just change things to constituencies, not go into it here. It's a question of having a commitment to a democracy that belongs to all who live in this country, as the Freedom Charter and the Constitution says. So it's not a unique crisis that we have here. It's one that's found throughout the world, and you can see it in the United States elections. But it's one where we've got to consciously think, how do we involve the masses of the country in their own life experiences and mobilized and organized, not just in anger or outrage, but in achieving goals that cannot be achieved simply by voting. We have, I said there's a lack of a common vision, but we don't have politics in the political public sphere. It's depoliticized. We need to repoliticize it with an emancipatory vision that is universal in a South Africa where we all feel we belong. Thank you.
Thanks so much for kicking us off with that and sticking exactly to time, Raymond. I'm going to call on June Bam, also known as June Bam Hutchinson. Thank you.
Thank you so much and for this opportunity. And just to say, it was such a wonderful start to see the community speaking first. Congratulations on the organizers for really decolonizing how we do conferences, the most important voices, our communities, our people, our 1976 generation who made the sacrifices. Thank you. And so I speak here with the mercy and the important acknowledgement of those struggles. And just about myself, I was a history teacher on the Cape Flats for many, many years. I used to be able to fetch the children from the gangsters and deal with them and say, you know, give that child back to me. That child's not going to go horizontal in a coffin out of the township. The child has to come and do some history lessons and overthrow apartheid. And now I have to get protection orders against gangsters and stand in court. Please, Your Honor, can you just protect me so that I can teach and speak? And work with the communities. So I think that sort of summarizes what I want to say about what happened to history teaching and historiography and the discipline and the challenges that we have. So I come from a very global struggle. In 1976, I was 14, Standard 7, and we used to do Chile, Victor Jara's poetry, and the global struggle, and also really understanding the whole history of the Palestinian oppression and oppressions all over the world as integral to our own freedom and democracy, and that we should never be silent about these things at a time, especially of ongoing genocide. So just to say then very quickly that this really links very directly to history teaching and the history discipline, because how do you teach and do research at this time on history? So the main issues for me in the country today, and I'm talking about an experience of at least a long time, starting with the Rivonia trial as a baby in the early 1960s, but then going forth into the new South Africa with all our wonderful policies. But we've put in our policies, Fiso and Lovo is here, and I worked with him in 1995 on bringing in indigenous knowledge systems into the schools, and the story goes that those books vanished. And so I think that really summarizes the political economy structures, systemic structures we're up against in the disciplines and in South Africa, where we've had wonderful achievements. We can move where we want to go. We can be free to talk and say things, but at the local level and within the systemic structures, we are still very much controlled. And to me, it's about the ecologies in the disciplines, such as in history as well, in historiography, because with colonialism came the ecology of what became capitalism, Afrikaner capitalism in our country, and the land, if you don't give the land back, you can't also really teach in a particular way that can really critically engage material conditions of the working classes and the poor. And so an interdisciplinary approach is extremely important. And we see this especially when we do oral historiography, getting to the stories, because the TRC didn't allow us to get to the stories. It was, amputated at one stage, and the UDF, of course, was disbanded. And so in the street committees where these knowledges were taking place, they're no longer there. So you find the discourse on Tyler, who does this water thing in Rwanda. You find they're saying, what is she? Is she a colored? She's mixed black and white. Who is she? And we find these essentialisms and tribalisms, and you wonder what has happened over the 30 years after all that fantastic work we were doing on Africanization in Africa. There are also so many silences, and it also comes with, if you're teaching history now, and in the historical discipline, where there's still so much control in the political economy. I work with many communities. I still work with women collectives. I work with restorative justice, unemployed people. I work with people really at the margins, very poor. And they will tell you that the problem is that we're in a knowledge trap. Whose knowledge matters, whose knowledge counts, and how does it count, and how does it get validated? So historians are also very guilty of this in the disciplines. We have black scholars and oral historiographies and other ways of knowing are still being excluded. So I, for example, work with the OC, which is across frontiers, the feminist knowledge holder of knowledge and rituals and really African knowledge, and it takes us across these essentialisms. But will OC ever feature in an account of historiography of South Africa? I don't think so, because somebody else is going to count it out. And who are these people? So are we really listening, and are we really making things count, where South Africa is now caught what I would call a political economy about knowledge production? And so these women with their knowledges of ancient deep time across cultures in Southern Africa, the OC, for example, they've been erased with colonialism, and we need to restore this. And you see it with the Amazon development, where we had death threats because of foreign capital in cahoots with local communities, dividing them, developing on a floodplain. Climate crisis is not even regarded, and women's, what their knowledges of these ancient ecosystems, it's also not regarded. You also see it in Kolobeni, with that development in the Eastern Cape, and this is directly linked to historical understanding. So I think, given the fact that the TRC was prematurely ended, and the UDF was also prematurely disbanded. I think the working class has suffered a lot. I think we are extremely elitist, and I think the role of the historians would be to restore understandings of working class historiographies and oral historiographies so that we can get to the Makulus, we can get to the knowledges of the Aussies, and in that way move towards what one would call cognitive justice in the disciplines, and going back to the local, as the African scholar Archie Mafeje has propagated a long time ago. And of course, he was not allowed to be counted at the University of Cape Town at the time, even though he was a foremost professor in the world. So we need to restore these knowledges that were erased with apartheid capitalism and colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, June. I think I'd like to ask Tula Simpson from University of Pretoria to speak now.
Thank you very much, everybody. Okay, I'm also going to speak on history. Radical South African academic historiography had a coherent agenda during the apartheid era in seeking to deconstruct racial categories through class analysis. This emerged as the only viable post-apartheid historiography, as its conservative alternative was discredited. The progressive scholarship has, however, struggled to determine its role in the post-apartheid order, and I'm going to speak about those challenges in my presentation. A fundamental question has been what attitude to take to the new dispensation. One option is to resume the radical critique, but to apply it to the ANC by challenging it from the left for its neoliberalism or austerity or some other betrayal. Yet the ANC, its South African Communist Party and COSATU allies, and most recently its EFF and MK offshoots, all identify themselves with those ideals. One may disagree with them in that regard, but beyond a certain point, it's difficult to argue that their interpretation, or how those organizations interpret these ideas, is key to what those ideas could ever practically constitute in the South African context. In other words, you can't keep juxtaposing the ideal to the way it's the only manner in which it's going to manifest itself. A second response has involved partnering with the new authorities and building the new nation. The Wits History Workshop offered an example. It was a radical voice against the apartheid regime, but it subsequently partnered with the incoming ANC government in projects such as building the Apartheid Museum. That project offered one manifestation of the growth of the heritage sector in the post-apartheid era. Another manifestation is owed to the fact that the discipline lost the student pipeline that teacher training had formerly provided it because the ANC subsumed history into the social sciences, ending history status as a special subject that teachers were required to learn. Now, plummeting numbers combined with tourism's emergence as a sunrise industry to foster the development of the discipline of heritage studies, which not only entailed shifting research foci, but also adjusting curricula to offer training for prospective entrants into the tourist industry. The Department of Historical and Heritage Studies, of which I'm a part at the University of Pretoria, offers one lasting legacy of this survival strategy. But a further challenge was represented by related developments within history as a discipline internationally. Now, among historians, a perennial uncertainty exists as to whether history counts as a special subject area offering its own laws and lessons, or whether it's a second-tier subject principally of use in discovering laws in disciplines such as, say, economics or warfare or diplomacy. If you want to generate a condition of status anxiety in a historian, you should push that button. Now, whether history stands as a primary or secondary tier subject sometimes manifests itself as a debate about whether to spell history with a capital H or not. In the late apartheid era, history was a capital H subject, with the literature being invigorated by a specific theory as to its operations, with arguments about it driving output. But that enthusiasm has faded subsequently, which reflects a broader historiographical trend which is reflected in international debates about the challenge of postmodernism. The decline of those capital H debates have affected the discipline, informing many aspects of history's contemporary public face. Interest in grand theory has declined, but at the same time, antiquarian interest in history in its own right remains relatively weak. calls for interdisciplinarity as a means of reinvigorating the subject and restoring its status within academia, and for efforts to be undertaken to boost its relevance and impact beyond the discipline in the public realm, testified to a broad dissatisfaction amongst historians about the limitations of the discipline in its larger stage, as if loss of engagement with those larger themes that dominated the late apartheid era risk the discipline with meaninglessness that needs to be addressed from without. Now, I would argue that this approach is to the detriment of debates both within academia and in the broader public. To take the former, for example, the value of interdisciplinary engagement depends on the vibrancy of the disciplines themselves. If the disciplines have nothing to add, they can't contribute to these debates. Hence, it's not a paradox to argue that in-depth focus amongst historians on their craft is a prerequisite for the discipline, both enriching and being enriched by contact with peers. History uncapitalized is often faulted for its empiricism, for offering a litany of dates, names, and events, yet the enlargement it provides to our knowledge spatially and temporally contributes more than anything to liberating us from the tyranny of the here and now, i.e. the limitations of empiricism. But more than that, it adds depth to theory, as through its counterfactuals it checks over hasty generalizations and interrupts the flows of the kinds of dogmas that result when universals are constructed on an inadequate base of particulars. It opens the way to possibility and alternatives of the kind that are badly needed in our present-day national discourse. It is in history for its own sake that work is most required, in response to the brief that we were given for this presentation. Hence, what is most needed now in the South African university is time for historians to think, to read, and to write, on the understanding that being practical in undertaking and addressing contemporary challenges will best be done by expanding inquiry as widely as possible. Again, this is no paradox that in order to address the particular, you need to have a deepening understanding of the universal and the global and the deep historical. To achieve that end, we need to broaden specializations beyond those which pertain in most history departments, which focus far too much on the modern and on the local, by which I basically mean the region. You struggle to get beyond the Limpopo in terms of the research specializations in most history departments. But to reiterate in conclusion, at the core is the revival of disciplinary engagement on topics such as sources, on methodology, on narrative, and on platforms. In this way, we can facilitate bigger research and thus a more impactful role for the discipline within academia and in the national life of South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Tula. I'm going to ask Baso and Zenze from UJ to come up.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. So I have shape-shifted from earlier when I was Vice Dean in Humanities, and now I'm here in my capacity as an Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations here at UJ. So I've elected to talk about the state of political science, its evolution over the last 30 years. And so what I'll be giving is kind of a general overview, but with some numbers as well to back up some of what I will be sharing. And it is, I would like to think in the form of a compliment sandwich. Everyone know a compliment sandwich? Where you say something nice, put in a bit of criticism, and then you end off with something optimistic. So let me say the state of political science in South Africa is in a very good shape. South African-based journals of political science are world-class. We have some of the editors here. There's Martha Bridgman, editor of the South African Journal of International Affairs. There's Professor Ntabiseng Mutseme, who's the editor of Journal of Contemporary African Studies, where incidentally I'm also her deputy, so she's my boss. So there is a world-class academic infrastructure in South Africa as pertains to political science, the journals, the book presses, an active association, the South African Association of Political Studies, which has a biennial conference, often with a very healthy attendance. We are also plugged into the African continent through the African Association of Political Science, which was resuscitated in 2021 through the efforts of the South African Association of Political Studies, and it now has a journal which has also been accredited. And the South African Association of Political Studies also has a journal, Politicon, which is accredited. So South Africa is also plugged into the continent and the rest of the world through IPSA, and political science and the act of political analysis enjoys a very high status in South Africa. I often joke that everyone wants to be a political scientist in South Africa. When something big happens, we look to political scientists to make sense of what is happening. So some of the focus areas over the past 30 years that have emerged when I reviewed the state of political science in the country include protest, include studies of inequality, the various ways in which it manifests. It includes, of course, South Africa's role in the African continent and the world in general, particularly in multilateral fora. But there's been less of a focus increasingly on South Africa's role within Africa, and I think this is an outcome of South Africa's own foreign policy as a country turning less and less towards Africa, and generally South Africa's foreign policy being less and less clear. There's also been great studies on voter behavior, what motivates South Africans to go out and vote or not, voter apathy. And of course, in studying a young democracy, there's been a lot of work on institutions. But what are the problems then? Where do I think there could be and needs to be improvement? First, I would say, and it's great to follow historians on this, I think what you do is really important, but it's rather different from what we should be doing. But I'm finding increasingly that there is no theoretical development in South Africa, right? The South African scholarship tends to be case study focused. It does not develop big theories or mid-range theories for that matter. So there's a tendency to test theories developed elsewhere, to search for their applicability, slightly amend them perhaps when you apply them to South Africa. You can think of various theoretical paradigms here which are developed elsewhere and are tested out in South Africa. There hasn't been that uniquely South African theoretical contribution across the board. There's also a slow pace of transformation, especially on gender, and one could easily, I was thinking the other day, one could easily count basically on their fingers the number of black South African full female professors. It's actually quite shocking. Very, very few such colleagues. It's therefore a male-dominated space, and I think we are missing out on potential insights. There's also a lack of multilingual work. So this democracy that we're celebrating, the constitution under which we operate in Section 6 commits us into advancing multilingualism, but you'd be hard-pressed to find any book, any journal that does work in any of the 11 South African languages. Well, any of the 10 South African indigenous languages. And then it's interesting to follow the Chilean foreign minister, because Chile is the country with the most bookstores per capita in the world, right? But when you juxtapose that with South Africa, there's generally, I think, quite a low reading culture in South Africa. In fact, my great hero and colleague, Dr. Mutobi, always jokes that, in South Africa, people are more interested in booze than in books. And so that is not, that does not bode well for the development of these disciplines, because a reading culture is quite critical. So let me then end off, as I promised, with a positive note. So I ran a survey, which is now in its second year, among political science graduates. I've got now over 1,500 responses. So one of the questions we ask Prof. Simpson and Prof. Bam Hutchinson is, what subjects did you study in high school, and do you feel they prepared you for what you encountered in university? And 65% of our respondents said they did history in high school, and they feel that indeed it adequately prepared them for what they encountered once they got into university. The other question that the survey asks is whether you intended to study political science, and did you even know what political science is? And we find, to no surprise, most didn't know, and the career they would have preferred is actually law. And I think also Raymond had similar aspirations once upon a time. It's a very famous story with I think UCT. They finally gave you your law degree. So the students generally don't know what is political science, majority of them, but once they get in, they feel that history has prepared them for success. And then the other question that we ask is, do you intend to study political science further, right? So do you intend to study into postgraduate studies now that you have encountered political science and have been immersed in it? And the figures are almost reversed, because basically 72% said that they didn't intend to study political science, but then 60% of those who are in political science, now that they know what it is, say that they intend to carry on with political science. And so it is my hope that the next generation of political scientists will be able to build on that great foundational work which was laid by the first 30 years of democratic scholarship in South Africa, and that it can develop further. I'm still looking forward to those uniquely South African theories of politics and international relations. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Basil. We're going to now turn to our online speakers. So if you could get Divine on the line first and unmute. Yeah. It's so interesting for me. People talk about the lack of a reading culture and the lack of books and how they're not important anymore. But in every presentation we hear, these are the factors that come up as still being important. That's what I'm most interested in. So we're turning over to Divine now, who's joining us online. Thanks. Please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity of participating at this very important reflection and also this panel, and thank you to the previous speakers. I'm going to make a really brief intervention. I'm coming from anthropology and also the space of producing Pan-African knowledge and also publishing and research and also training. I'm based at the University of Cape Town, Faculty of Humanities, where we really do work with building epistemic communities of young Africans, to think together or collectively, and also how to give value to African knowledge production. So for my reflection today, I want to continue with a point that has been raised by previous speakers to really look at South Africa's, I think, position and engagement or relationship with the continent. So 30 years onwards from democracy, what is our relationship with the African continent? I grew up in Cameroon, where I started my early studies, and that's where I engaged with South Africa at a very early age. And also, I was born in a place also of struggle in Bachem, where the UPC, or what used to be called the Maquisards of Cameroon, were fighting for liberation and against French or what you would call global colonialism. And I think many years onwards, more than 50 years onwards, we are still asking critical questions about what the struggle was, what this independence was, and what we have achieved after those many years. But with respect to South Africa, many years ago, if you deploy the term Africa, it meant one of many things. One, it meant a person, a particular person, particularly dark. It referred to the dark continent across the Limpopo. It also referred to a particular group of people whom the laws of that time considered that people who should be in particular places called reserves. And for the global community, Africa was a place that needed to be fixed. And Africa was a place either of diseases or a place that was not a site for knowledge production, or a place that we needed to come to collect raw materials in terms of data and test experiments, but not a place where we could actually either learn from or a place that developed a theory. And I think that from 1994, what we need to really reflect on is what has become of our conceptual idea of that place, because before 1994, South Africa operated as a place on the African continent that happened to be on the African continent, also because of a relationship with global Europe or whiteness, as we have come to hear and see. And I think our relationship with knowledge production from the continent was really with that, because South Africa for many years, before 1994, saw itself as an exception and a place that needed to connect immediately with the North, with the West, because the rest of the continent was a dark place, or a place that needed to be treated really spatially with its own theories. And we can see today, when we look at statistics on knowledge production, whether it's on publications, or whether it's in the growth of scientists, or whether it's in our strategic relationship with knowledge production, with connections in the world, that after 1994, the push, to connect to the continent, to build a strategic relationship with the continent, seems to have reproduced that exceptionalism that we had before 1994. So despite our attempts to try to ground ourselves, to connect ourselves with the continent, we seem to be driving to a place where we're still defining ourselves as an exception and still defining the continent as a dark place for journals that we consider as predatory journals, a dark place for scientists that we think do not have the tools or are not competent enough for us to engage with, or a dark place with institutions that we don't seem to build collaborations with, because the North and the West still continues to be the place that we connect with. And that even though we produce knowledge here, we just happen to be universities that are located here. So as we review this period, whether it's in my discipline in anthropology or in African studies, or in the knowledge that we produce, a science with respect to the African continent, I want to push that as we move onwards, we need to think critically and repair this relationship with the continent, so we don't continue to see ourselves just as an accident that happens to be on the continent, or as a place that seems to be connected to the North and do not need to build relations, connections, and collaborations with the rest of the continents that we seem to work with and continue as dark. So my push 30 years onwards is that we need to take ourselves within the context of decolonization seriously as a place that needs to deepen its relationship with the continents, with collaborations, with connections, take knowledge that is produced on the continent seriously, seek to build more strategic relationships with the continent, so we don't continue to reproduce ourselves as an exception. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And we have one last speaker who's also joining us online, Tempinkosi Goniwe from Rhodes University and Gallery MOMO. He's there, but he's still muted, so there's still, from his side, our technology is set up, it's working, and he'll join us as soon as possible. Yeah. I wanted to say one thing about this panel and about how it links to the book series as well, and that is, and perhaps this is how publishing is often seen as almost like something in the background, bringing together speakers and building connections. And I think it's been very interesting to me to look at the way in which we structured this book series was to bring together local publishers as well as a large international publisher, Routledge, which is particularly good, of course, at distribution then as well, and marketing. And I was told to show the brochure too. There's lots of marketing materials. But at the same time, this isn't an extractive relationship. This is much more of a partnership where we are not taking IP or copyright out of South Africa and giving it to the global north in some sense, which I think is often people's fear with this kind of co-publishing arrangement, where this actually, the IP is very much still lodged within South Africa and with the scholars who produced these works originally, but they are now being given an opportunity. As we said, we are relaunching works. They're given an opportunity to reach a much wider, broader audience than before, and we're able to show how they are still relevant in the present day from the past 30 years or so when they were first produced. So that's part of the reasoning for why we also developed this as a co-publishing partnership, so that there is both the opportunity for our own scholarship to move to other communities worldwide, but also for the scholarship that we produce to be seen as relevant worldwide. It's not that we have the situation of African studies scholars coming to South Africa for 2 weeks and then taking their knowledge to the West as well, to the North. He's not responding. Bebe, will you just get in touch with Tembin Nkosi and see if you can get him to respond? Yeah. Perhaps I'll ask in the meantime then our panelists so far if there was some way in which any of them would like to respond to something that one of the others has said. There are definitely some important strands that are coming out about knowledge production, about who produces that knowledge, what kinds of knowledge are considered relevant and important, and which ones are considered less favorable in the present day. So is there anyone who would like to make an intervention, to say something at this point? You're keeping quiet.
We agree with each other.
We could then call on the audience perhaps.
Okay.
Thanks. Is there someone, I think I see one speaker there and Sifiso as well then.
Okay. I think I've got so many comments. The first one is our colleague in Cape Town, the anthropologist. I'm not sure, is he in Cape Town? Okay, he forgot to inform us that it's the anthropologists themselves who taught us about scientific racism and social Darwinism. They are the ones who were pushing forward those theories I was complaining about. At the same time, they also cannot answer the question in terms of South African exceptionalism. Why is it that Tanzania and Zambia didn't change their national anthem? Remains Nkosi Sikelel' iAfrika. And also, the fact of the matter that there are South Africans in the diaspora who still reside in those countries. They emigrated from South Africa in the 19th century. They're called the Ngoni. The others are called the Barotho. Barotho are from the Free State. The Ngoni are from the northern Zululand. And the most famous of that group, which left with Zwangendab, are Mzilikazi in Zimbabwe, the Ndebele. We've done such work in our publication, The Road to Democracy in South Africa. Those are the 8 volumes. And also, in terms of historiography, you have to also factor in the argument that Afrikaners the translation is Africans. So Afrikaners, according to themselves, are the original Africans. And in terms of your analysis, they are outside your analysis. The last point is, I'm the chairperson to, particularly my colleagues who presented on history as a discipline. I'm the chairperson of a ministerial task team. History is often reviewed, and June knows the project we began with in 1995. I've been tasked for the former Minister Motshekga, to do the exercise again. So soon there'll be public hearings, and please, we need the inputs from the common public, and also, in fact, even what Tula and you, June, were saying, as soon as the syllabus that we have we start from grades 4 up until grade 12, we have come out with revising caps needs an input from the public. So I was happy in terms of your interventions. I hope you will see that advertised after the government guidelines has been drawn, and please make inputs. We might not be correct in terms of what we are suggesting, but at least we're dealing with all the issues that you've raised.
Thank you so much, Sfiso. We're going to try and connect with Tembinkosi again. There we go. Thanks. Please go ahead.
Am I connected? Something is not
Yes, you are.
in order. Okay,
We
thank
can see
you.
you and hear you.
Oh, you can see me, but I can't see you. Okay, anyway, let me thank Abebe for the invitation, and also thank Professor Leroux for the introduction. And I just want to appreciate the speakers that have been speaking so far. Especially appreciated Nomboniso's keynote. I wish I was prepared like she was, and also the speakers that were there. And Nomboniso made a point here about how Abebe does things when he brings his friends into the picture. I was not given a proper brief, but in any way, not to blame Abebe. What I want to speak about are two things here. One is in the visual art, or in art history, so to speak, what has been in the last 30 years. One of the developments that we have appreciated is the growth of catalogs around artists. I don't think we have developed a strong culture of publications. I mean publication in terms of books. There have been some few books on art, visual arts, in the visual area, but there hasn't been books to the extent that the political sciences or social sciences and history, the publications that are coming out in different presses, whether it's Wits, whether it's UNISA, and many others. Whereas for visual arts, it's very scant, so to speak. So we still need to do a lot of work in that area insofar as publishing books, whether they are peer-reviewed books or they are books on biography or monography of artists, let alone books that will be covering certain moments of art history, especially in the 20th century. That would be one comment I would like to share. The second one is that there's been also a lack in terms of journals. You know, I mean, of course, we have the great long-standing journal, the Art, which is based in UNISA, and for a long time in the 90s and 2000s, we have Arthrop that has managed to sustain the publication on visual arts in terms of reviews of exhibition, profiling of artists, and dialogue and so forth. And in the 2000s also, we have Art South Africa coming on board, providing one of the beautiful space where we can not only read about art, but we can see quality reproduction. Because part of the challenge with producing or writing about art is not only the text compared to most of the peer-reviewed journals. Because what we see in peer-reviewed journals are mainly texts compared to images. When artworks are reproduced, either they're black and white, even those black and white are so bad in quality, they take away, you know, the quality of those artworks. And part of that is a problem I experienced as a student. When I was at UCT in undergrad, where I would be studying about foreign arts such as Europe, Latin America, and America, using, in the days it was slides, those poor reproduced slides. It's worse one is in black and white. And the fortunes of traveling, when you get to MoMA, for example, or you get to Tate, you see the actual things, it just changed completely. The meaning of this artwork, the way they look aesthetically and all of that. So in other words, the journals that we have, they have not really moved into accommodating the visual arts in a way in which we would like, as far as the reproduction of these images, let alone writing about the ongoing developments in the contemporary art developments. That would be my second one. And I started with appreciating catalog. Most of the history of South African art, especially contemporary art and modern South African art, resides in catalogs. It will be great, for example, to revisit those catalogs to find ways in which they can be packaged or brought into a series of books that can be published in a way in which Abebe has proposed for this series of 30 years. So that will be my short comment. As I said, I just want to thank for the opportunity. As I said, I was not here to critique. I will share what I think the visual art still lack. And I'm optimistic of the possibilities as we move forward. Thank you.
Just say, speaking about art, we've got wonderful artwork that we're using for the covers of these books by Blessing Ngubeni, one of our local artists. So I just want to recognize his contribution as well. We had another speaker from the audience. So I think we could take another few comments from the audience and then have the panelists reflect as well.
Thanks so much. Good morning, or afternoon, I guess. Gustavo de Carvalho. I'm a senior researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs and a PhD candidate in IR at WITS. I just wanted to first thank you for this event. I think I'm Brazilian. I've been in South Africa for the last 15 years, and I was talking to Nomboniso during break that one of the hard things of being a migrant, and especially a long-term migrant, is that you were grounded somewhere, but you become a bit contextually detached from where you were born, and you are contextually attached to a place, but you're not grounded there. So I think events like this really help to, for me at least, to learn a bit more about the 15 years prior to before when I joined. But it's not really a comment. It is a question to Prof. Basu. And you, I think you spoke about something really fundamental in terms of theorization within political science and international relations. I poked Martha here because we had some interesting debates about that earlier this year. And partially for me, I think what the challenge, I think it relates to what counts as theory for many of us as well. I think if we're looking to the theoretical thinking of Amilcar Cabral or Kwame Nkrumah and many others within the continents, that we tend to disregard that as political statements rather than ways of explaining how the world is organized. And my question in that sense is to perhaps try to understand a bit more as a student how some of those contradictions within our field, that on the one hand it's wanting to decolonize more, it wants to be part of this fuzzy idea of what global international relations is or what it is not, but at the same time we're still often gatekeeping spaces, whether it's in journals or publications, and even what is considered serious international relations or political science discussions, to open up a bit more the idea of knowledge in a way that makes political science and international relations far more connected to what an African and South African idea of that is. So thank you very much, and thank you once again for all of the speakers. Really fantastic to learn from you. Thanks.
The speakers to reflect on those as well. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm not an academic political scientist or anything like that. I'm just a person. And I have a very simplistic view of all of these things. And so one thing that's coming out for me and something that I've been thinking about for maybe 30 years is what I see as the failure of democracy globally. And I wonder about the relationship between capitalism and democracy and the role that that plays in the failure of democracy. And just touching on also the idea of the role of art, I think about a movie I saw some time ago where the corporation was the government. And at least that was like honest and straight up. But right now I think that's what we're experiencing, but we're not acknowledging it. And so I'm wondering, if the panelists have any comments on that, and also the question, the very simple question, well, what are the alternatives to both capitalism and democracy? And I wonder what you might think about a kind of combination of benevolent dictatorship with participatory decision-making grounded in feminist principles. Like, yeah, let's just fantasize and imagine, and where would that take us?
One more at the back, okay? And then right at the back, and then we'll talk to you.
Thank you. It's an honor to come as an individual rather than wearing a hat that is 42 years old. I am intrigued by the comments that are implied as well as the major event that has just taken place, which if we overlook it, we will commit the same problem in 1994 when we close our eyes to the genocide that was taking place in Rwanda. I am now referring to the watershed elections in Botswana. Do they have a meaning for us? And what lessons can we draw from these important elections? Thank you.
There's one more comment right at the back.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Terence. I'm a medical doctor. I joined the ANC and Umkhonto Wesizwe in 1976, so I come from that generation. I lived also in Germany, which is where I got my medical degree. I'd like, let me say first, I relate very strongly to what Dr. Raymond Satner was talking about, this lack of a shared vision. It's the core for me. And of course, it also goes along with the lack of a collective patriotism that we don't seem to be able to have. We are all South Africans coming from different backgrounds, races, and so on, and we really are not a collective unit. I'm bothered by the fact that in these institutions that, of course, are Eurocentric, and these institutions that give us platforms sort of allow us to a certain extent to develop some form of thinking that we then call progressive, in a is maybe, but I think the mic is seem to be we don't seem to be putting more weight on establishment of institutions that are actually informed by our rhythm of life that was dictated a long time ago. It looks like we can still remain with maybe I should just talk without the mic. I'm not sure whether I can be heard. I'm going to be brief. I'm not. I'm worried about the kind of an African, especially in urban areas who has emerged in the past 30 years. And I'm worried about how that generation actually looks at itself, those who are African amongst them. And I'm worried about institutions in this country that are Eurocentric, that say they are finding connections with the rest of the continent and, of course, the world. What is it they are taking there? What kind of a mindset do these people have coming from those institutions? Which part of them actually is really based on African rhythm of life, our ways of doing things, and what informs us in terms of running this country? And whether or not some form of democracy, if we call it democracy, should be established that actually speaks to almost 80% of the population in this country. That benevolent dictator the lady was talking about there, it's actually not a far-fetched idea, according to some other people, of sorting out problems like we have in this country. Thank you.
I think we're first going to get a round of interventions from the speakers, and then we'll see if we can get some more comments from the audience as well. Is there anyone who would like to jump in?
Okay. I didn't want to say it's Women's Month, but anyway, yeah. I'm fascinated. I'll take on the question about global capitalism and this trap that we're in, and feminism and that. And just to say that the kind of, I think we need to come up with new conceptual frameworks and methodological approaches, because it's not just about changing, say, the content in what we're learning and say, content on Africa, because that in itself is not going to bring about the change. It's really about what I would theorize is about understanding how capitalism is developed and on a kind of ecology. All those things that hang together, and that ecology involved what I would call 7 concomitant erasures. So it was just not just the erasure of people, their culture, their language, their land, their knowledge forms, and total dislocation. So in order to be able to really tackle, and I'm sort of very skeptical of ideology, to really as a term and as a concept as well, to really tackle the material contradictions and deprivation of the majority, especially women and children, with food security and the climate crisis. We really need to get into building a counter and establishing a counter ecology to deal with epistemicide, because capitalism thrives on epistemicide, and we see that in these big development projects, with this constant erasure of the knowledge and belonging and land. And we see it also with the, for example, in the Rooibos deal, where access and benefit sharing models just worked for a few, not for the indigenous people of South Africa in their collective entirety. And we see this also with the land question, such as the Richtersveld and so on. These models don't actually work, and it's because they're closely aligned to the capitalist model. But if we listen, and my theory in my scholarship is also on a kind of deep listening, which is not just literal listening with the ears, but a kind of really respectful, intuitive learning listening to deep time knowledge, and the knowledge, these women or feminist ways of knowing, working class knowledge actually, because that's the indigenous people who've been, their land's been taken away, they the working classes, and it's the working class knowledge that one has to get into and give people confidence in that. And so my approaches, understanding the past in new kinds of ways. So how do you understand the past in terms of studying the knowledge of plants and the vibrations and frequencies of plants that these women have that transcend the cartographies of the nation state, and get us to really understand Africa's history, Southern Africa's history, global history in very new ways, even through a word like as Osi, which is a Khoikhoi word that has survived, which can tell us so many things and connect us in archives, like the ritual archive that the historian Falola theorizes about. And so we need to theorize ourselves, we need to study our own ways of knowing. And I think for me that is a way in which to get past the trap that we're in 30 years after democracy. Just completely a whole shift of how we think about South Africa and how we think about knowledge. And I think that what is very important is for learners and young people to understand knowledge, how knowledge is produced, epistemology, really understand how knowledge is produced, and listening to forms of knowledge which we thought in the past is savage knowledge. Thanks.
Before Baso responds, I also want to partly respond a little bit to the theory question, but also throw it back to you. You know, I've heard this so many times. People would say, where are the Fanons of South Africa? Where are the Amilcar Cabrals of South Africa? And why don't we theorize? The question that I often throw back is, who said they aren't here? And I want to make an example around the feminist movement, the women's movement, for example. We grew up in movements that characterized South Africa, South African patriarchal system, as a triple oppression. It was not necessarily original, but it was a specific way of theorizing the relationship between race, gender, and class in our society. And the mainstream political theorists in political science and all that in the academy have not necessarily picked up on that. There's a way in which, so when young people now in scholarship talk more about intersectionality, it's as if it's been discovered by this generation of and part of it is erasure of women's knowledge and women's ways of explaining their world and women's ways of reproducing knowledge. I hinted at agriculture, but you know, that's a different conversation. But I'm saying, how ready, firstly, how convinced are we? What is it that we base our claims that there isn't enough theorizing? Especially because in the feminist movement, in the women's movement in general, I would argue that there has been that attempt. And secondly, how ready are we to listen and to study what people are bringing you know, to us? Even concepts like motherism, you know, there's a particular way in which motherism is looked at in Western feminist theories, but there's a particular way in which we look at motherism and the way it unfolded in the liberation struggle as a radical intervention. So, yeah.
No, please give a round of applause. Thank you so much. So I think your two questions are, as you rightly say, quite related. And I think your last point especially, Menon, it touches on what I said about the underrepresentation of black women, full professors in the discipline. So I think we are of similar mind in that regard. And I would even readily admit with you, Gustavo, that there is, I think, a neglect, misunderstanding of what I would call the intellectual archive of Africa, right? And I think that does require a lot of work. And I hinted earlier that there isn't much work in indigenous languages as well. And there is an exception to that, who's with us today, Mema Kozazana Klaba, who's also a professor of practice with us here at UJ, who has published Frantz Fanon in isiZulu, which I think is a monumental feat. So this is to say there is a lot of archival engagement that is needed, including work done in the liberation movement, which I think broadly dovetails with the Pan-African work that you referred to. My sort of intervention is to say then, what after the liberation, right? Looking back at the last 30 years of democratic scholarship, right? What has it given us that is uniquely South African in that regard? And without essentializing, right? It just seems to me that we've abdicated a lot of thinking about South African questions to the outside world. I mean, Professor Hausman of Harvard is the go-to economist for the government, right? On political economy questions that are central to South Africa. And it just struck me that there's a case to be made, and I think Peter Vale did try to make this a few years ago, that actually international relations is a subset of political science originated in South Africa, pointing to the Milner kindergarten, the origins of the Round Table. But I think there's a continuity here. I mean, what sort of theories did they produce? I couldn't tell you. So I think there's a continuation, and I think it speaks to South Africa's place in the world, this lack of theorization, because even the Round Table, even the attempt to create a South African Council on Foreign Relations, South Africa is a very reactive country towards the rest of the world. And a lot of who we write for is actually not each other, something I'll come back to. It is the outside world. Your scholarship is legitimate when it is highly regarded outside of South Africa. And I say that as Vice Dean Internationalization, who is meant to actually drive this kind of extroverted nature of South African scholarship. We can't even get a PhD passed in South Africa without at least one of the examiners being from outside of South Africa. How absurd is that? You'd never see that in the US. So there is this kind of, what do they call it? Low self-esteem, inferiority complex. And that touches on something else, which is the NRF, right? The NRF. I think you're quite right, Nomboniso, that there's a lot of neglect of intellectual work being done in South Africa because everybody is incentivized to be original, right? By the NRF. That's what the NRF incentivizes you to do. You must have a niche, which means you must, in a sense, always claim to be original. I mean, and it manifests in small ways, right? It's rare to get, for example, a book reviewed by another professor in South Africa because they're too busy writing their own work, right? They're not too interested in what other colleagues are doing in the discipline. And I think that's a shame because that is how theory builds, when we read each other's work and we build on it. So that's my answer to that. So that's not to say the NRF doesn't do other good things. It is a very important body. Okay, but I think it's too dominated by the lab scientists, right? By the lab scientists who can have a niche and sort of focus on one atom for the rest of their careers. Whereas we deal with with society, which is complex, but it leads to these perverse incentives. Then the Botswana election, quite seismic. I think it was quite a monumental moment. I think it's going to lead to other actually countries. Well, there's a question whether there's what's now already being called the Boko effect, because that's the new president, whether it is a continuation of what started in South Africa in May, or whether it is something new altogether. But I think if you look at the reaction, it has. I think it's going to unleash challenges to dominant parties. And then the question of the benevolent dictatorship, I'm one of those who doesn't believe in that. I think when you advocate for a benevolent dictatorship, you are playing a genetic lottery, right? Because yes, you might get a benevolent dictator. You might get a dictator who's benevolent, but you can't guarantee that. It's really literally up to the person. So you're creating a paradox. There aren't many Lee Kuan Yews in the world. There's many more Mugabes and Mobutu Sese Sekos, frankly. So it's like going back to monarchy. You're playing genetic lottery, and you hope to God that the next one will be good. But with democracy, you may not like the current person, but give them 5 years. You'll vote them out. And I think that comes back to us needing to be more engaged citizens. So thanks.
I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time, so we're going to have to continue these conversations over lunch, which is upstairs. I don't know if there was one last point that anyone wanted to make, something that you felt you just were misunderstood or that you really think is a takeaway for this session.
Can I plug a book? Can I plug a book of mine that just came out on this question of benevolent dictatorship in South Africa? What kind of presidency does South Africa need? It's out, it's open access, UNISA Press. It's called Super President, the history and future of executive power in South Africa. I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't do that.
So, thank you so much to all of our panelists, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to everyone's comments as well, but let's continue over lunch. I would encourage you actually, Baso's comment has made me think, go and Google the different panelists and see what their recent publications have been, because there really are some important books and articles that have come from all of them that I'd love to highlight. But thank you once again to all of our speakers and panelists. That was a really diverse and vibrant debate, and we really appreciate it. Thank you.